For 41 years, my wife told me she spent every Friday morning across the county line helping her cousin run a little bakery in a town I'd only driven through twice. She'd leave a little after 7, before the dew was off the grass, and she'd be home by 2 with a box of day-old crullers and the smell of yeast on her cardigan. I never once questioned it. Why would I? I was just a retired tool and die man from outside Springfield, Ohio, a fellow who'd given his whole life to a stamping plant and his whole heart to one woman, and who handed over his paycheck every other Friday without ever asking where a dollar of it went. But 3 days after I buried her, my own son stood in my kitchen, slid a glossy brochure for a managed care facility across the counter, and told me I had until the weekend to pack a bag, because the house I'd re-roofed twice with my own 2 hands was being listed Monday morning. They figured I was finished. They figured I was a soft old man who'd cried himself empty and would shuffle off wherever they pointed me. What none of them knew was that a small brass key my wife had tucked inside her recipe tin would lead me to something worth a little over $19 million and to the calmest, coldest reckoning those people will ever live to regret. Before I tell you how I took back my dignity and let their own greed do the rest, do me a favor and tap that like button, and subscribe if you've ever been written off by the very people who were supposed to carry you. Tell me down in the comments whether your family ever underestimated you the way mine did me. My name is Russell Hadley. I'm 68 years old, and I have lived in the same corner of West Central Ohio my entire life. I married Eleanor Whitman in the spring of 1983. In a Methodist church with a furnace that never worked right, and I loved her in that quiet, plain way that men of my generation were taught was enough. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe I should have asked more questions, but she was the steady one, the one who balanced the checkbook at the kitchen table under a swing-arm lamp while I dozed in the recliner, and somewhere along the way I just let her carry all of it. The money, the bills, the worrying. I worked the line, I brought it home, I trusted her with every penny of it, and I told myself that was a kind of love too. The morning we buried her, it rained the way it only rains in Ohio in November, a gray, soaking, sideways rain that gets into your collar and stays there. I stood at the edge of the grave at Ferncliff out past the old fairgrounds holding my hat against my chest, and I waited. That's the part I keep coming back to. I waited. I waited for my son to come stand next to me. I waited for my daughter to slip her hand into the crook of my arm, the way she used to when she was small and frightened of thunder. I waited for somebody to say we'd get through this together. Instead, they stood off under a cluster of black umbrellas 10 or 12 feet away, dry and close together, and they whispered. My son kept glancing at his phone like a man waiting on a delivery. My daughter dabbed at her eyes, but her mascara never ran. And my daughter-in-law, that woman my boy married 11 years ago, she didn't whisper at all. She just stared at me across the wet grass with a look I'd seen before, only on the faces of men at the plant who were about to swing a deal in their favor. It wasn't grief, it was arithmetic. I took a step toward them. My knees popped in the cold. All I wanted was to go home, sit in my chair, smell the lavender hand cream she kept on the windowsill, and maybe pour a finger of the bourbon I'd been saving for our 40th, which we let slide past unmarked because she was already too sick to lift a glass. I needed comfort. I needed my family. But before I could get a word out, my daughter-in-law broke off from the group and came toward me, her heels sinking into the soft ground with every step, and she didn't seem to mind one bit. "Russell," she said. "Not Dad. Not even Mr. Hadley. Just Russell," like I was a contractor she'd hired and was now dissatisfied with. "We should talk about the arrangements going forward." I told her my wife had been in the ground less than 15 minutes. I asked, couldn't it wait until we got home? I was tired. I was wrung out. "That's exactly the problem," she said, and she reached into a handbag that cost more than my first car and pulled out a folded brochure, damp at the edges but legible. Sunset Meadows, a 2-star assisted living place out by the interstate, the kind with a fountain in the lobby and a smell of disinfectant you never quite get out of your clothes. Look, you're 68. Your pension's small. Social Security barely covers your prescriptions. Eleanor handled everything, the bills, the taxes, the whole works. Without her, you'll be underwater inside of 3 months. We're trying to help you. I felt the heat come up my neck. I looked at my son. What is she talking about? That's my house. I put a new roof on it. I paid that mortgage off 12 years ago. My boy wouldn't meet my eyes. He's always been that way around her, soft as bread dough. Dad, he mumbled, it's complicated. The house was in Mom's name. And last spring, when she got the diagnosis, she signed it over, power of attorney, then a transfer into a trust, to protect it from, the nursing home costs. The ground tilted under me. Eleanor had moved the house and never told me. I tried to make it make sense. We'd done everything together, hadn't we? We did it for you, my daughter-in-law cut in, stepping neatly between me and my son the way she always did. If you got sick, Medicaid would have come after the house to pay your bills. We saved your equity. But now Eleanor's gone, and frankly, we have obligations. Your son's business took on debt. Your daughter's behind on the kids' tuition. We can't have you rattling around alone in a 4-bedroom farmhouse eating up what's left. What's left? The phrase sat in the cold air between us. They weren't talking about my home. They were talking about a balance sheet, and I was the line item they wanted to zero out. The agent comes Monday for photos, she went on, checking her nails. That gives you the weekend to box up your personal things. We'll have a crew haul off the rest of the junk next week. Junk, she called it. 41 years of a marriage. My wife's sewing things. The cradle I built when my son was born. I didn't argue with them in that cemetery. I want you to understand that, because it matters to what came after. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I'd spent my whole life in a place where a man learns that the loudest fellow in the room is usually the one with the weakest hand. So I just nodded, said I'd need a ride home since they'd come in my daughter's SUV, and I rode the whole way back in silence in the third row while the three of them talked in low voices up front about square footage and comparable sales, as if I were already gone. That night, alone in the house, I did what a grieving man does. I wandered. I sat on the edge of our bed and held one of her sweaters. I stood in the kitchen with the lights off, and around midnight, not knowing what else to do with my hands, I started going through her things in the little back room she called her office, which was really just the old mudroom with a desk crammed into it. That's where I found the first crack in the story. In a bottom drawer, under a stack of church bulletins and grocery coupons clipped and rubber-banded by month, there was a manila folder. Inside was the deed transfer my son had mentioned, and he hadn't lied. The property no longer belonged to Russell and Eleanor Hadley. It belonged to the Eleanor W. Hadley Revocable Living Trust, dated 9 months back. I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking. The woman I'd trusted with everything had quietly taken our home out of my name, and I'd never signed a thing, never been told a word. But it was the second item in that folder that stopped my heart. Tucked behind the deed was a single sheet of trust paperwork, a successor trustee designation, and the name on the line where the future of everything was decided wasn't my son's, and it sure as hell wasn't my daughter-in-law's. It was mine. Russell Hadley, successor trustee, sole beneficiary. They told me the trust shut me out. They'd let me believe it, but the paper in my hand said the exact opposite, and the only reason they could lie about it so confidently was that they'd never imagined I'd dig deep enough to read it for myself. They'd handled the deed transfer when she was sick. They'd never seen the trust she rewrote 3 weeks before she died, the one her own lawyer had drawn up in an office 2 towns over on a Friday morning, while everyone thought she was frosting cinnamon rolls. I sat down hard on the floor of that little room. It took me until almost 3 in the morning to find the rest. The recipe tin, the dented red one she'd had since we were newlyweds, was up on the shelf above the stove where it had sat my entire married life. I'd never once opened it. Why would a man open his wife's recipe tin? But that night I took it down, and underneath the index cards in her looping cursive, the meatloaf and the apple slab pie and the rolls everybody begged her to bring to the church potluck, there was a small brass key, worn smooth, and a card. On the card in her hand, First Federal of Clark County, Box 219, Friday 9 a.m., and below that, 3 words that I have not stopped hearing since: they underestimate you. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with that key in my fist until the sky went gray, and somewhere in there the grief started to change shape. It didn't leave. I just made room beside it for something harder and clearer. My wife had left me a map. The least I could do was follow it. Monday morning, while my daughter-in-law's real estate agent was no doubt sharpening her camera lens, I put on the same black suit I'd buried Eleanor in, because it was the only one I owned, and I drove the 45 minutes to a town I'd passed through twice in my life, to a squat brick bank on a corner with a faded awning, and I walked in holding a brass key like it was a live coal. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, asked if she could help me. I told her I had a safe deposit box, number 2119, and I set the key on the counter. She looked at it, then up at me, and something passed over her face I couldn't read. She asked my name. I told her. And then she said the strangest thing. She said, "One moment, sir. Mr. Albright asked us to call him personally if you ever came in." A few minutes later, a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead came out from the back, and the moment he saw me his whole face changed, like a man recognizing a photograph he'd been shown long ago. "Mr. Hadley," he said, and his voice cracked a little. "I'm Howard Albright. I'm the branch manager. I've been the branch manager here for 31 years. He shook my hand with both of his. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you. Your wife was the finest client this bank ever had, and the finest person I ever knew that wasn't kin." I didn't understand. I told them I just wanted to know what was in the box, whether she owed them money, whether I was about to find out my wife had been in some kind of trouble. He gave me a sad, knowing smile and asked me to follow him, not down to the public vault, but back through a door, down a short hall to a smaller room with a heavy door, a single table, 2 chairs, and a lamp. He told me this was for what he called their legacy accounts. He brought box 219 to the table himself, set it down, gentle as a sleeping baby, and asked me for the key. My hand shook so badly I dropped it twice. I want to tell you I braced for jewelry. Maybe some cash she'd squirreled away, a few $1,000s from the grocery money. I told myself not to get my hopes up, that whatever was in there, it wouldn't change the fact that I'd been thrown out of my own home. But when Howard Albright lifted that lid, I did not see jewelry. I saw paper, stacks of it, neat and squared. The top sheet was a stock certificate, the old engraved kind, for a regional manufacturing company that had started in a garage in Dayton in the 70s and now had plants in 4 states. The date on it was 1986. The number of shares made my eyes blur. I picked it up with 2 fingers like it might bite me. Under it was a deed to a strip of commercial buildings on Main Street in the town we were sitting in. Under that, a deed to a 40-acre parcel of farmland leased to a seed corn operation. Under that, account statements, mutual funds, municipal bonds, a folder of rental properties, 11 of them, little brick houses scattered across 3 counties, every one of them owned free and clear. I couldn't breathe. I looked up at him. I asked him how much. The words came out before I could stop them. Albright took off his reading glasses and folded them slowly. "We did a full valuation last month," he said quietly. "At Eleanor's instruction, once she knew she didn't have long. Between the equities, the real estate, the leases, and the cash. As of 3 weeks ago, the estate stands at a little over $19 million. The room went silent in a way I have never heard before or since. $19 million. I was a man wearing a funeral suit because it was the only suit I had. I was a man who'd worn the same winter coat for 14 years. I was a man whose own son had handed him a brochure for a state-funded nursing home and given him a weekend to clear out. And here, on a wooden table in a back room, was enough money to buy and burn down every Sunset Meadows in the state of Ohio. How, I finally managed. How was this possible? We lived on my paycheck. We clipped coupons. She gave me $50 a week for gas and lunch, and we counted it close. We never had anything. Howard Albright leaned forward, and there was such tenderness in his face that I had to look away. "Russell," he said, "do you remember the $50 a week you handed her? You gave her the rest, every check, for 40 years, and she took what you earned with your hands and your back and your time in that hot plant, and she made it grow. She came in here every Friday morning at 9. She sat in my office. We drank tea, and she learned, and she invested, and she bought low and held on, and she built this. dollar by careful dollar, so that one day, if these people did exactly what she feared they'd do, you'd be standing here instead of in a home." He paused. "She told me once, and I'll never forget it," she said. "Howard, my husband thinks he's the weak one in our marriage. He has no idea he's the foundation everything's been built on." I put my head down on that table, in that little room, next to $19 million, and I wept like I have not wept since I was a boy. Not for the money. For her. For 41 years of Friday mornings, I thought I knew the shape of, and never did. She hadn't deceived me out of disloyalty. She'd deceived me out of the deepest loyalty there is. She saw the storm coming decades before the first drop fell, and she spent her whole quiet life building an ark, and she never once asked for credit. When I lifted my head, the grief was still there, but the helplessness was gone, and in its place was something steady and patient and very, very cold. I asked Howard Albright 2 questions. First, was the trust valid, and was I truly the trustee? He said yes, ironclad, drawn up by an estate attorney named Margaret Coyle, who'd handled my wife's affairs for 15 years, every signature notarized, every transfer recorded at the county. Second, did my children have any legal claim to any of it? He said no. The house transfer they'd arranged when she was sick had moved it into the trust they assumed they controlled, but Eleanor had quietly rewritten the trust afterward, naming me. They had executed the very mechanism that protected me and never read past the first page. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because I've thought about it a great deal, and I'm not entirely proud of all of it, and I'm not entirely ashamed either. I did not call my son. I did not warn them. I went and saw Margaret Coyle that same afternoon. A sharp woman about my daughter's age, with a corner office and no patience for nonsense. And over the course of a week, she and I confirmed everything, recorded what needed recording, and put a quiet hold on the house listing through a single letter from her firm. My daughter-in-law's agent got a call canceling the Monday photos. I imagine that's when the first crack of worry went through that household, though I wasn't there to see it. Then I did something I'd never done in my life. I did nothing, and I let them come to me. It took 4 days. My son called, then my daughter-in-law, each in a sweeter voice than the last. There'd been a misunderstanding, they said. The agent must have gotten her wires crossed. Of course, there was no rush about the house. Of course, Dad should stay as long as he liked. Why didn't we all sit down together as a family and talk it through? I agreed to the family meeting. I suggested we hold it at Margaret Coyle's office, so it'd be more comfortable, neutral ground, plenty of chairs. They walked in there, thinking they were coming to manage a confused old widower, and they sat down across a long table from me and my attorney, and I watched the color drain from my daughter-in-law's face as Margaret laid out the documents one at a time, slow and even, the way you deal cards to people who'd been cheating and just realized the dealer knew. The trust. My name on it. The valuation. The fact that the house, the farmland, the rentals, the shares, the cash, all of it, every dollar, was mine to direct, and that the children's claim to any of it was precisely nothing. My daughter-in-law recovered fast, I'll give her that. She started talking about family, about fairness, about how Eleanor would have wanted them all taken care of. I let her finish. Then I did the only thing I had planned in advance, the only words I'd rehearsed alone in that empty house. I slid 3 envelopes across the table. The first was for my son. Inside was a copy of the brochure for Sunset Meadows and a note in my own hand. You were ready to send me somewhere to be forgotten so you wouldn't have to be inconvenienced. I have decided to honor your judgment about how the elderly should be treated. You will not see a cent of your mother's money. What you do with the life you've built is now entirely up to you, which I understand is the most frightening thing in the world to a man who has never had to. The second was for my daughter. Hers was gentler because she typed on a phone at the grave instead of laughing about square footage, and a man has to weigh these things. It said only, "You stood and watched. Watching is its own kind of answer. The door is not locked, but you'll have to be the one to knock, and it will take more than a phone call." The third I handed directly to my daughter-in-law, and I made sure I was looking her in the eye when I did it. It was empty, not a thing inside. That, I told her, is the inheritance you've been working toward since the day you walked into this family. I just wanted you to hold it in your hands. She left first. My son sat there a long moment, and for just a second I thought he might say something real. something a son says to a father. But she called his name from the hallway, and he got up and followed her, the way he always has, and I understood then that I had not lost a son that day. I'd lost him 11 years ago and only just now noticed. Here is the part people always want to argue about, and I understand why. I did not crush them. I want that on the record. I had the power to. With $19 million and a good attorney, I could have made their lives a misery in 100 legal ways, called in the favors, bought the note on my son's failing business, and foreclosed it out of pure spite. There was a week there where I wanted to. The cold thing in me wanted very badly to. But I kept hearing my wife's voice. They underestimate you. Not destroy them, not ruin them. Just, they underestimate you. And I came to understand that the cruelest and kindest thing I could do, the only thing that might actually save them, was to take away the one thing they've been counting on their whole adult lives without ever earning it. So I simply closed the gate. No more checks, no more bailouts, no more inheritance to wait around for like buzzards on a fence line. I let them fall, and falling is the only thing that ever taught any of us to stand. It's been 3 years now. I had Margaret quietly keep tabs, not to gloat, I told myself, though maybe a little to gloat. Last I heard, my son had lost the business, gotten divorced from that woman the moment the money turned out not to exist, and was running a forklift at a distribution center outside Columbus. 6 months of perfect attendance, paying his own rent in a studio apartment. He looked tired in the one photo I saw. He did not look broken. He looked like a man learning at 44 what it costs to earn a thing. My daughter sent me a card last Christmas. Just a card, no ask in it. I haven't answered yet, but I haven't thrown it away either, and that's its own kind of door. As for me, I never moved out of the farmhouse. I re-roofed it a 3rd time last spring because I'm stubborn and because she'd have wanted it done right. I gave a chunk of her money to the church that buried her, and a bigger chunk to set up a small fund through First Federal that helps widows in 3 counties learn to manage what their husbands left behind, so no woman around here ever has to do alone what Eleanor did alone for 41 years. Howard Albright runs it with me. We meet on Fridays. We drink tea. I think she'd like that. I keep her photograph in my wallet, the one from the garden, sun hat and dirt on her gloves, holding a basket of tomatoes and smiling that secret smile I never once understood while she was alive. For 41 years, I thought I was the strong one, the provider, the one holding everything up. I had it exactly backwards. She was the fortress. She was the one who saw what our own children would become long before they became it, and she armed me against the day, and she did it all without ever making me feel small, which is the rarest kind of love I know of. So if you've ever been handed a brochure when what you needed was a hand, if you've ever been called a burden by people who exist because you got up and went to work every single morning of their lives, hear me. The money was never the point. The money is just a thing that shows you who people are when they think you've got nothing left to give them. Real strength is the quiet kind. It keeps the receipts. It bides its time. And dignity, the only thing they truly tried to take from me. Dignity was never something they had the power to hand out or take away in the first place. It was always mine. It just took a brass key in a recipe tin to remind me of it. I think about that brass key more than I think about the money. $19 million sat in a box I never knew existed, and the thing that still keeps me up at night is the size of what I almost missed. For 41 years, I believed I was the strong one in my marriage, the man holding the roof up, and the truth was that Eleanor had been holding me up the whole time, quietly, every single Friday, while I dozed in my chair and never thought to ask a question. The lesson I keep turning over is simple and a little embarrassing. The people who do the real building rarely announce it. What happened to my children didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen as some kind of punishment handed down from on high. It happened because of choices, theirs and mine, stacked one on top of another over years. My son chose to follow that woman instead of his own conscience, and the marriage that was built on the promise of money fell apart the day the money turned out not to be there. That's not fate. That's just what greed costs when the bill finally comes due. I didn't have to destroy anybody. I just had to stop being the thing that propped up their bad decisions, and they did the rest themselves. If I could put one thing in a young person's hands, it wouldn't be a check. It would be the habit of doing right even when nobody's watching and there's no reward in sight. The way Eleanor sat with Howard Albright every Friday for decades and never breathed a word of credit. It would be the patience to actually read the papers in front of you instead of believing what people tell you they say. Because the only reason my own children could lie to me about that trust was that I'd never bothered to learn my own affairs. And it would be the backbone to keep getting up. My son runs a forklift now, pays his own rent, looks tired but not beaten. And I'll tell you the honest truth, I'm prouder of him in that studio apartment than I ever was of the man waiting around for me to die. I re-roofed the farmhouse again last spring. My knees are worse, and it took me twice as long as it should have. And I did it anyway, because that's the only kind of strength I've ever trusted, the kind that shows up and does the work. Eleanor saw the storm coming long before I did. She didn't save me from being poor. She saved me from being a man who never found out what he was actually made of. That's the inheritance I keep.